On behalf of GBS, I want to thank you and welcome everyone to today's session. This is our second webinar educational session in our ongoing healthcare education series. We're hosting several of these throughout the next couple of months. We're glad you could join us today. We're going to be talking about leveraging healthcare technology. I am Lindsay Bruderly, the Sales Operations Manager here at GBS. I also have with me who's about to do our introduction to our presenter today, Jackie Davison, who's the Senior Vice President of Business Development. Just before we go ahead and get started, just a couple of things. I want to let everyone know that you're in listen-only mode, and as time permits, we'll open up the phone lines at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. But during the presentation, feel free to ask any questions at any point in time using the chat feature. We'll be aware of that, and we'll be asking questions as they come through via chat. Some of the initiatives that we're talking about in our educational series to provide insight education, drive top initiatives, increase efficiencies with technology, and that brings us to our very timely topic of today. I'm going to pass it over to Jackie Davison to do our introduction to our speaker this afternoon.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, it's an honor to be here with all of you, and I'm the SVP of Business Development at GBS. And you know, as I think about technology and what's happening with practices and with hospitals, for that matter, who are looking for a better quality of life, having fun at work, making sure that they have the things that will help them, you know, succeed and thrive in the future. You know, there was no one better that I could think of than Jeffery Daigrepont to actually do this series for you. He is truly an expert in technology across many factors, from cybersecurity to EHRs to contracting compliance. You can see from his bio up on the screen now that he just really has a wealth of information. He speaks across the country and now virtually at groups like HIMSS and MGMA, and it goes on. Jeffrey and I and the Coker Group, actually, we co-worked on some healthcare executive forums a while back, and those were very much about education to our peers and to our groups like yours. A personal story about Jeffrey. Jeffrey, we're showing our age a little bit here maybe, but it goes back about 20 years. You were my first, one of my first electronic health record clients. You negotiated the contract for them and helped them make a better decision and make sure that they got what they wanted for their goals. And they're still a client of ours today. But that's how I originally met Jeffrey and the Coker Group. And it was great to work with him. And I think it created a win for the client, a win for GBS, and a win for the Coker team. So, so thanks, Jeffrey, for being here. And with that, I really appreciate you helping us out with this session.
Yeah, Jackie, thank you for the introduction and making me feel old. So appreciate that. No, truly an honor.
Anytime.
Yes, absolutely. The only thing I'll mention that Jackie didn't say is that we don't have any conflicts of interest with any vendors, including GBS. So we've always prided ourselves on being that objective third party. And so today we're going to cover actually quite a bit of information. We're going to try to compress it in a very short period of time. So if you feel like you're drinking from a fire hydrant, I apologize in advance. But like I said, we're going to try to cover a lot of ground. And of course, as always, you can reach out to any one of us afterwards. Shoot me an email. If you want a copy of the slide deck, be happy to send it. I think there'll be a recording sent out afterwards, so you'll have a chance to go back and revisit if you missed something. So the first chapter I thought we would cover is, just kind of a brief look at the journey. What has it been, and how are we now moving sort of beyond EHR? And if you sort of look at the universe of data, a lot of the experts that study the market, specifically where they invest their money and where the venture capitalists are chasing and the private equity, is all things data related. So the belief is that data will become the new currency. And so I think the first generation of automation was probably, at best, electronic filing cabinets that were isolated. And now we're moving beyond isolation to full integration. You'll see more examples of that here in a second. And so when you kind of look at the levels as we've grown, we're really somewhere between level 3 and level 5 right now, which is, I rarely meet a practice that doesn't already have an EHR. Some, unfortunately, have EHRs that are already commercially discontinued or soon will be, or maybe they're generation 1, or maybe you're dissatisfied, maybe you're frustrated because you're at level 3 and you're trying to get to level 4, and you realize there's some barriers. So we call this the displacement market. There is really no more green space. You don't see a net new practice or hospital that's saying, hey, I need help buying an EHR. In fact, we rarely even get asked to do that anymore, and even if we do, they already have a sense of what their options need to be. They're familiar with the vendors. We all know Epics at every hospital. We know that other vendors like GBS have stood the test of time, and you'll see in a slide in a second where I'll show how the market has dramatically contracted here in a second. And so, of course, some of the drivers, no surprise to you guys, shared savings, MIPS MACRA, direct to employers even, and also we're going to see more and more consumer-driven services. I think one of the positives, there's not many, but one positive from COVID is that it has re-level-setted the expectations around consumers and their access to the providers, specifically through virtual care, telemedicine, and things akin to that. So I think those practices that get ahead of the curve are the ones who may have already been there seem to have done extremely well, and candidly are actually bouncing back at levels better than pre-COVID because they figured out that they can actually increase their capacity, and they've gotten real creative in coming up with ways of doing just that. Other advances that we expect, more robust analytics. I think we're going to see a lot more wearable type technology that's going to be tying back to your doctors, dashboard reporting, pop health, and I got some examples of these coming up. So, you're seeing more and more medical devices that are out there for consumers that can dial right back into their caregivers. In fact, in ophthalmology, they now have a scan, an artificial intelligence scan that can read certain retina-type diseases with a high degree of accuracy. That's even more so than the human eye can do, or actual providers that read those same tests. So doctors are unsure about this. Makes people a little bit nervous, right? Because, as they say, one man's, junk is another one's fortune. So is this going to shift the revenue streams? Because today a lot of our providers do rely on ancillary services as a way of making ends meet. Artificial intelligence is now becoming really prolific within healthcare. I'll share something that may make many of you feel uncomfortable, but a lot of vendors are now exploring with listening type devices in the exam room. So like an Alexis device, they're listening to you and your doctor have the most intimate, private conversation. How does that make you feel? And would it provide you some comfort maybe if the listening device had information that could help your caregiver perhaps give you better care? Maybe it actually documents something that may have otherwise gone misunderstood that can be later back. On a personal level, I'm kind of okay with it. My only requirement would be I think the industry and the doctor's office will owe us the opportunity to know it's occurring. So as long as my consent's there and I have the option to opt out, I think I'm okay with this because we are seeing more and more, voice activated listening. In fact, have you ever seen where your phone will alert you that says, hey, you have a meeting to be at in like 20 minutes and you need to leave the house now because traffic is, going to take you so long. So we're already sort of having virtual assistants looking after us, knowing that there's traffic, knowing we need to leave our house now to make that meeting on time. So whether you realize it or not, there's probably already this type of technology in your life, and you may or may not like it, but I think that's just kind of, where we are. As you define artificial intelligence, I think it's important to know, at least for the time being, you kind of have what's called machine learning and deep learning. They kind of both fall under AI. Machine learning is what we typically see in most health systems and among physician practices, which I'll give you some examples of in a second. Deep learning is where the technology can evolve and adapt accordingly. In most medical uses today, they cap it off, preventing it from evolving beyond its intended use. But a lot of ethical concerns you can imagine, what happens if there's bias in the machine? What happens if there's harm, who owns the intellectual property. So a lot of those things are being looked at. And here's an illustration example. So the one on the left, that's an example of machine learning. And a great example of that is, let's just do it real quick. I hit, 1 for a certain department, right, within a hospital. And then the next question might be male or female, right? And depending on which one of those two options I pick, it has now eliminated a lot of different options, and maybe it's now channeling me to the next one. The next question might be, do you smoke? And if I said no, then of course all the questions germane to what you would ask a patient, how long, how much, how frequent, those things are now gone. So it's basically just an algorithm of elimination. Whereas in deep learning, each one of those bullet points is feeding back to the last, and it's making calculations, and it's adapting through statistics and outcomes. And this has a lot of problems because, to give you an example, I don't have any really good ones in healthcare, but in the court systems, they were using one to sentence criminals. And the AI could tell, based on that criminal's history, the likelihood of that person being a repeat offender. And the judges would use that information and in some instances give harsher sentences. Somehow or another, the AI was defective, and for whatever reason, anyone that was born in October was more likely to be a repeat offender. Had no logic to it, had no correlation to it. It just happened to be that was the data element that was feeding back. Maybe there was an adverse number of people that went to court that week in October, born with dates of birth in October, but you can sort of see how those kind of things can become problematic. I know that in healthcare, we are looking at AI. There's companies like LexisNexis that can go out and tell you with a high degree of precision which patients can pay and which patients will not likely pay on time. And where that can be extremely helpful is that now you know who to isolate as potential high risk. But is it ethical? Is it fair? Do we treat people different if we know that information? We probably would, because human nature kicks in and we're suspicious of someone that's not going to pay simply because the AI said they don't pay anybody on time. And today you have no way of distinguishing good people with good credit versus bad, and maybe that's a good thing. But my point being is that the deep learning tends to have more of the ethical problems than the ones that you can cap it off. And this is an illustration of a chatbot, which this is a little frightening, but we are seeing vendors, telemedicine vendors, actually deploy chatbots to provide baseline intake with the patient and interact with the patient. And in some cases, the chatbot will take it all the way to making a recommendation as to what the likely diagnosis is. It won't necessarily render the treatment plan, but it gets very close. And some of these chatbots can actually detect stress in a voice, can detect anger, can detect sadness. They've really gotten pretty good. In fact, you probably get tricked, I know I do, when these automated robots call me on the phone and they got my name right. They have the all the he, she down right. I'm like 2 minutes into this conversation with a stupid robot before I realize I've been tricked into it. So they're getting good at being able to interact with us. So EHRs are basically, going to be the database that will feed a lot of this technology, and hopefully it will be put to good use and not some of the bigger concerns. We're seeing it show up in hygiene. This is a huge priority right now, especially with COVID. This example can detect if a nurse went into a patient's room and then proceeded to go to the next patient without passing sensors at a wash station. So sometimes nurses get very busy, or doctors, and they forget to wash between patient visits, and so these sensors will buzz if that occurs. Facial recognition, you might say, well, how does that apply to healthcare? We're starting to see examples of where patients can walk into certain businesses and automatically it recognizes you as that individual and perhaps all your interests and patterns and habits. I'm convinced that places like Home Depot and others already have this in place, because I've seen examples, personal examples of where I've been in, there, maybe it's proximity location, maybe other things that I'm actually broadcasting my location, but I've had really strange things occur when I'm there looking for a faucet, and an ad pops up for that faucet that I'm looking for. Now they're connecting the dots, and in fact, there's a special on Netflix that tells you just exactly how deep they're going. Upwards of 5,000 data elements on all of us. And again, I'm okay with this. I just think the businesses should give consent if it's occurring. One area where I think it could be a pretty big game changer is that it actually would be a great tool to fight against terrorism. So, for example, let's say if a known dangerous person, or even someone who was a criminal, maybe someone that was on the FBI most wanted list, walked into a hotel at a conference we're all at. I hope that artificial intelligence recognizes that person and sends off the alarms, or at least calls in the authorities to go check it out. So there are some good uses again. But, I don't like this whole, just randomly walking down the street or walking into a hotel and they already know if you're, a big spender, you tip good, what you already like to order, how long you typically stay. That kind of stuff I think is a little intrusive. Other areas that we're going to see is continued shift in reimbursement. So everything moving from, volume to value, as they say. And I think we're going to see vendors obviously respond to this as their way to sort of enable their customers to take advantage of these incentives. Next, I want to kind of transition to what I call the e-communications. And I want to focus really more probably on the patient side and some of the new technology that we're seeing emerge. I always like to use this picture as kind of a lead-in to this topic. This is a very famous painting that you see at almost every healthcare conference. It shows up in all kinds of medical journals. And what's very fascinating to me, actually I'm very annoyed by this painting because I don't know the outcome of this little child. I want to know what happened. But there's a lot of interesting observations about this painting. First, you can tell this is not a well-off family, right? There's no two identical chairs in the house. The doctor is intensely focused on that kid. So the doctor is top of his game. You can see the daylight is breaking through in the window. So that tells you something awful is probably happening all night long, and they've been up worrying, and they're now, maybe at their end, or maybe they're recovering. But whatever happened, it went on through the night because morning is now breaking. What I relate to, don't forget the mother. The mother is just completely exhausted and is you can tell in agony there. But check out the expression on the dad's face, right? That father is literally relinquishing authority to probably a man he never met to take care of the one thing that any father would give his life for, which is his child, right? So that's an enormous amount of trust and confidence that just got relinquished to another individual. And the reason why I'm a little bit passionate about this painting is that despite all the automation, all electronic communication, everything that's occurring, one of the things I think that's killing our society right now is things like social media, text messaging versus just picking up the phone and talking to somebody. I think we're losing that human touch, that ability to interact. It's just so easy to say things that we wouldn't say if we were actually in person. So while I'm all for electronic communication, I think we need to be grounded in the fact that there's a patient on the other end. There's a father, there's a mother, there's a child these are not insignificant communications. It's very important. So I'll get off my bandwagon and move on. Sorry about it. I didn't mean to throw a wet blanket on our webinar, but that's kind of how I relate to that picture. So today we're trying to communicate, right? We're trying to find all kinds of ways to connect. Sometimes we're being forced to do it because meaningful use and things akin to that say if we don't, get on with this, then we're probably not going to get paid incentive money. And so one example that you're probably familiar with is a portal. I love portals, and GBS has a great one. So do other vendors. What I like about the GBS solution with NextGen is it's fully integrated into the product, so it's seamless, right? And sometimes you find them as third-party products, and it gets a little bit wonky between the two applications. But this is a really great way to boost revenue and to boost your way to connect the practice. In fact, in many instances, we're seeing these touchless practices with COVID, and patients are checking in through the portal, and they're getting messages through the portal. The doctor or nurse will actually come out to a car and talk to you outside while you're waiting in the parking lot. So a lot of innovative things here. It can boost revenue. Studies show that practices that use portal for online bill pays are, significantly reducing their days in AR and their bad debt. Sometimes people will embed it right into your website, so you're not making your patient go 2 places. You just sort of have the link here, and then from there it can jump into your portal. That's an example of that here. There's a lot of confusion right now about HIEs versus Pop Health versus portal. There are differences in all three, and they all serve different functions. So when you start unpacking health information exchanges, this is not where you get insurance. This is the concept that a lot of states and hospitals have set up these health information exchanges as a way to create interoperability. Haven't been that successful, because you still have a lot of data conflicts. And more recently, there's new rules around the CARES Act and data blocking that's forcing the vendors to now publish their APIs. So kind of pay attention to this. I think we're going to see better seamless integration across multiple platforms, so patients can then move across different caregivers. The reason why I think we struggle with HIEs is that the vendors really never had the interest to be compatible. But if you look at some of the more successful vendors that we know of, look at Apple, right? What does Apple do? They publish their API. They want everybody in the market space. They want apps to be compatible on that device. They didn't hold back. They said, here it is, knock yourself out. And now we have an entire ecosystem of applications that are fully integrated with that platform. So that's kind of the concept behind it. So we see all kinds of types. There's ones that are local, there's advanced, there's community driven, and they all have various different flavors behind them. But the one thing they all have in common is that they're intended to aggregate data in a repository and then hopefully make it easier to share it across multiple locations of care. And this is kind of an illustration of what one might look like. Pop Health, I don't get this. I hear a lot about it. I think it's probably cool for primary care if that's your thing. But I think Pop Health is just a fancy way to say wellness, to say care coordination, all the things we've been doing. Sometimes vendors have additional modules for this. There's a lot of standalone companies that do just Pop Health that will work with your EMR. The reason why I'm not trying to downplay it, I mean, you need to know about it. It's in play. Just be aware that you want to find out if there's really a financial driver behind investing in Pop Health, because your EHR can probably do most all of this already, but be that as it may, it's in play. And again, example of that. Analytics, this is probably the one thing I get most excited about, because I go to practices all the time, and it's painful to watch leaders like yourself, go through the forensic accounting of trying to figure out what's going on with your practice. It's hard to make decisions. All the data is retrospective. It's not proactive. You can't make predictions. It's hard to forecast. And worse, a lot of times your doctors don't trust it, and for good reasons, because nothing is reconciling. So we are starting to see a lot of advancements in dashboards, even to the extent that they're pushing out your key performance metrics to you in real time. And this is something, if you're not familiar, the folks at GBS can show you some of theirs. These are really great visuals. These aren't theirs. These are just examples that we got off the internet, but they're all very comparable. They're basically tools that, versus you going and searching for data, it recognizes what is the data you are most interested in, and then it pushes it to you. And I think that's a huge game changer, because now we see it quicker, we can intervene faster, and we have better visuals into what's going on. And sometimes the way you can correct performance issues among your staff and doctors is just simply show them the data. You take the emotions out of it, and just, here it is. You're in the red. You're not closing your notes. You're not coding right. You're not collecting copays. This is the data. You can sometimes compare that to the peers, and it helps sort of send the message without having to, make assumptions. So conclusion here, I think there's a lot of great opportunities and really exciting things occurring in that realm. All right, so shifting gears a little bit. This is usually when I make vendors like GBS cringe a little bit, because they think I'm going to, tell you things to do with your contract. And as Jackie said, I appreciate her saying this, the way we got to know each other is we were actually sitting across the table, and we were negotiating terms and conditions. And back then, you would have saw something that looked like this, hundreds of vendors in the market. And these vendors, the vast majority of these logos on this slide don't even exist any longer. So the market's been consolidating. a lot of mergers. GE and Athena combined. Cerner bought VitalWorks. McKesson was bought by Allscripts. Allscripts bought Practice Fusion. NextGen had its share of acquisitions. There was a time when we thought Siemens was probably going to buy NextGen, but NextGen, along with Epic, along with Allscripts, I would say along with Athena, is probably continuing to sustain, whereas others have lost market share. Greenway, total dumpster fire over there. They're losing customers left and right, largely because they, not the customers, are discontinuing their products, and then they decide they're not going to, then they are, then they aren't. So a lot of confusion. We are seeing some erosion within Allscripts on some of their platforms because they bought several. And then, of course, you have a lot of the niche vendors in the market that just simply weren't able to get enough market share to stay in business, so they are obviously going. And, of course, this is where I make my shameless plug. If there's anything we can do to help you as an objective third party, and by the way, we don't charge to give you a review or look at your contract. We feel like we have some strength in numbers over here simply because we're looking at so many contracts at any given time. So always happy to give you some visibility into what you should expect and some feedback. And even if you already have a contract, send it our way too. I'll tell you if you're being overcharged or you have unfavorable terms that in most cases the vendors are quite amenable to having that conversation with you. And if you're going to go through the process of looking, maybe shopping for a new system or going out, we can certainly help you with some vendor demo scorecards, maybe give you a template of an RFP. But let me caution you on RFPs. You'll hear this a lot. Lots of consultants love to sell you an RFP. I hate them. It's a useless document. It's helpful, but it's useless. Only because it just simply doesn't mean much anymore because the vendors are going to just give you the canned answers. What I recommend you do is do what's called an RFI, which is a modified version of this. Take the things that are most important to you. So, for example, if you have an ASC, you might want to know if the vendor can support 2 databases, right? Especially if you have more than one tax ID. You'd be surprised how many vendors get eliminated just on that one question. Maybe you're an FQHC. You probably need to put those sliding scale requirements and reporting requirements and things germane to FQHC. If you're an orthopedic practice, you're probably going to want to know about compatibility with some of the diagnostic equipment that you might have. So here again, don't put yourself through the pain of an 800-page RFP asking questions that you can probably find out answers just by doing Google searches. Just narrow down to the things that are most critical to your practice. But we'll be happy to give you templates of all this stuff. And then finally, if you want some help, we can certainly help you negotiate, terms and pricing. These are some of the things we obviously look at. And then when we do our terms, we look at these areas. You're going to hear a lot of people say, get a source code. This is so old school. Nobody gets this anymore. The reason why is most people no longer purchase licenses or technology. They really subscribe to it. So that if you're subscribing, you don't need a source code because you don't buy anything. The only time you might ask for a source code is if you're going to purchase that license. And the reason why you'd want one is if it got discontinued, you would want to have the secret sauce to reverse engineer the product if something happens to that vendor because you own the license. Whereas a subscription, you really don't own anything. It's like your cable, right? You're just paying for the channels whether you watch the channels or not. Assignment is a great one. And GBS is okay with this one. This just says if your practice got bought, you want to be able to transfer your contract to a new owner. You want to make sure you get future upgrades, make sure there's a warranty, understand how both sides can terminate and what happens after termination. You get your data back, you have to pay for it, how long does it take, what format. So these are all things that you want to make sure you consider. And then the last chapter, I think it'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't at least touch on the fact that there's major compliance considerations with sharing data, all the pop health, all the things that we're going to have to do to support MIPS and MACRA. If you're seeing Medicare, I really see not just Medicare, Medicaid, but the commercial payers are going to begin shifting their reimbursement to be based on outcomes. And I really, we're really going to have good data if we're going to defend against this, because they have the data. They have better data than we do. They know our utilization. They know how we compare to our peers. They know how much we charge. You might be, well, how do they know all that? Well, you send them a claim. And when you send them the claim, they scrape all that information and they profile you. Very few, I can tell you, I see it all the time. You know, doctors get these letters from payers that says, hey, we're observing your behavior and it appears to be unusual and uncustomary, and for those reasons we're not paying you. So they're tracking. So we got to track too and make sure that we have good defenses to participate, but also prevent them from reducing our compensation. And then here's my email address for the free contract review if you want to take us up on that offer. Again, there's no strings attached. We'll look at it. The only caveat is if you ask us to negotiate with your vendor, then that would require an engagement. But even then, that's very minimum. But I think a lot of times it's helpful, even if you're not ready, you just want some confirmation, some validation. We benefit from this because it gives me the chance to have greater visibility into what the vendors are doing in the marketplace, and then I can obviously share that in formats like we have today. So don't be bashful. Take us up on this one. So I enjoyed this. I'm going to hold the line for a few minutes to see if any questions or comments come in, or if even Jackie or others at GBS want to maybe make a few comments around some of the things related to this topic. So I'm going to pause here and see if anything comes in.
Jeffrey, thanks for this process. I think those three things or those four things, topic chapters that you put together are very apropos. Personally, I think people are missing the concept of data being the value and understanding it. I think the practices who got that early on and figured out how to work their data and know it better than their peers are winning. And so I think that's the big one that's there. I think certainly engagement with the patients and all the different ways that you can communicate with the patients are incredibly important. And it's almost demanded now with that consumer-based approach. So right on track with there. And then of course, technology, some people have to base their future on where they're going, right? So they have to think about, can this product take us to the next step? And sometimes you need a bigger truck to pull the load, and sometimes you need a more nimble vehicle to get around the corner. So, it's all part of that process. And then finally, looking at when you're talking about contracts and negotiations, I think that's one of the places where people, miss. And one of the big pieces they miss, in my opinion, is what it takes to make those changes and what it takes in, what's in the actual game plan to lay out the change and do it well, so it's not a painful experience. So absolutely, all those things are critically important. Do you have any questions for the field?
Well,
Yes, go ahead.
No, I was just going to make a quick comment on that last point. I know one of the things that I think vendors appreciate too is that conversation opens up expectations, and so both parties go into this with the right understanding of the needs and objectives. There's nothing worse than starting a project to learn after the fact. And I can promise you, vendors don't intentionally go into a relationship to make mistakes, but it is a very, very complex project, and especially nowadays when you're migrating from one EMR to the next. I can tell you that GBS goes above and beyond in helping their clients accommodate to move their data. And so on that point, if you're not ready to leave now, go proactively get your contract amended so you can get your data back. I don't want to have to, put you in a position where you got to hire expensive consultants and pay vendors high fees to move data. You need to be able to use your data. So now will be the time, to ask for that, because it's going to come up at some point.
That was sorry, Jackie. I was just going to say that was a perfect kind of segue into one of the questions that I had received about migrating the data. So, are you seeing in the marketplace certain specifications for migrating the data? A lot of groups that are acquiring different practices and things like that. The the complexity of migrating and kind of pulling the data together between different sources. I mean, what's kind of your take on that in the marketplace and how to navigate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of, I wish there was a one size fits all, but it really kind of first depends on what source is the data coming from and how well organized and structured. Some EHRs have no standardization, there's no structured data fields, it's just been freehand, typing and voice recognition and scanning in. You can actually create bigger problems if you try to remove unstructured data and then try to lay it back down into a structured database, a lot of mapping, a lot of complexity. What we like to recommend is don't over-engineer it. Let's just be very practical here. Let's identify and isolate only those patients we've seen in the last 2 years. So we take our database from, tens of thousands of patients to just a handful. And then of those patients, we all agree that we probably only need 5 or 6 key data elements that we can then sub-isolate again. So by the time you actually move the data, we've taken what was a massive giant database and we've narrowed it down to only the things that are most practical that would be needed for the next visit and of the patients that are most likely to come back in. The rest of the database that doesn't come over, we just simply archive it. So it's not gone. It's just that we're not going to attempt to move over 100% of the database when only 20% is really relevant, if that makes sense. You just sort of, the process of narrowing down to get to the cleanest, least liability, chance of corruption or creating conflicts, because you don't want to go forward with a new EHR and kind of destroy it. Now, there are third-party companies and partners vendors like GBS that can extract data, that can reconcile it, that can clean it up, and they've gotten really good at that these days. Your vendor that you're leaving could and probably will try to charge you for it. I've seen it as high as 10, 20, 30,000. There are some ways around that. You can, it's your data, and that's why I stress to get your terms right now before you face those high fees. There are some vendors that can extract the data with zero involvement from the vendor. But again, you got to be careful because you're moving data around. It's a patient privacy issue. It's PHI. So, anybody involved in helping you with that needs to make sure they are a business associate, they have proper insurance, they know what they're doing, because it is a big deal. So that's something that I encourage you again to get understood before you go ask a vendor who you're terminating from to give you your data back.
Yeah, we've seen astronomical prices to get data out of systems. So yeah, it's and we've worked a way around them creatively, but it's interesting. Sort of that whole data sharing thing, Jeffrey, has enabled a little bit of that data because people are used, in a lot of what I would say that a lot of the EHRs are now able to send the CCDA. That will help, but it won't get you all the data you probably want for an EHR transition. So that's the other thing. And of course, protection and transmission is critically important for protection. So agree. Any other questions out there?
There was another one that came across about interoperability. Sorry. So when you're talking about beyond the EHRs and all of the technology and future trends and gadgets and all of those types of things, are there certain considerations or steps in the process that you should take when looking at interoperability or integration or interfacing all of those different types of devices and technologies together?
Yeah, I think the key is to try to stay as mainstream as possible. Obviously, make sure that it has examples of capabilities. What I would caution you about is that right now, there's a lot of devices that they refer to as the Internet of Things. That it is what I just said, just things, right? They don't have operating systems. They're made in China. There's no real person to call. There's no way you can even resolve issues if those devices get hacked. I think that space is still evolving. There's still some standards that need to be developed. The FIRE standard is a good one to use. Most of the vendors that are healthcare specific, they're really focused. They're going to meet a lot of the HL7 standards that you'd want to see in products. They'll give you, proper protection to make sure that the data is moving across the platforms correctly. One of the places that you should probably start is most vendors now have what's called marketplaces, where they have, on their own time, went out and vetted third-party add-ons. And these are, oftentimes vendors that have put through a great deal of scrutiny to make sure that the platforms do in fact conform. So just be careful buying something that's not already vetted out by your vendor and expecting it to work properly. It may be, it may be vaporware. It may just be a concept, but there's no real interoperability there.
The other thing that you consider on that side, maybe I'll add to that, Jeffrey, is some EHRs want to be best of breed of most things, and they have options that are there, and that's sometimes a strategy of a particular practice or hospital. We're going to stick with this brand of lab or this brand of portal and this brand, but others want best of breed. And I think if you want sort of that best of breed approach, would you agree they kind of have to have that new API ability to connect to those other sites and maybe, as you say, the store, as you were thinking, that they've already done that vetting to allow you to pick a bunch of different best of breed solutions if you wanted something unique outside of the realm. And I like the best of breed model. That's kind of my approach. I like the ability to be able to connect to other items either through the interfaces of those individual solutions, or but that allows you to not just stick to one thing. If something's not working quite the way you want it, you can figure out a way to, pick the best. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree, and I think focusing first on what's available already in the marketplace gives you a higher degree of comfort, and then of course the next layer of that would be what's already compatible with the known API. The third layer would be, is there development that's needed between the two platforms, and of course if there's enough mutual business interest, sometimes the vendors will cover that expense. If the vendors feel like it's just a one-off, something that would only apply to your practice, then you probably need to go into that expecting that you're going to be funding the development for that interoperability. But if it's really benefiting your business need, maybe it's worth it. We see people all the time that you'd be surprised, they wrote their own software, they wrote their own app, they have maybe a product that's been in, that they found at some trade show that they really like, but the vendor's new on the scene. Vendors are always open to having those conversations, but it's going to be a buy, build, or develop conversation that you're going to have at that point. And if the solution that you're trying to add is already in the realm of being vetted, approved in the marketplace, a history, then your cost is obviously a lot less, and so is your risk.
Great.
Awesome. Well, Jackie, I always like to tell myself that when you don't have any more questions, that usually means you did a really good job covering the material, or people just ready for you to shut up. So,
there you go. Yeah.
I think I'm gonna take number one, the first assumption.
That's a good assumption. It's a great look at what you should look at as you're trying to build out your technology to kind of get you prepared for the next decade or so. Normally, these decisions don't happen in a day; they happen over time. So, as you're preparing and thinking forward, I think Jeffrey, you gave an outstanding review of everything that they might need to think about in that process. Lindsay, any other wrap up before we go?
Yeah, just a couple of things. We don't have any more questions. I don't see anything coming across, but before we end, just want to thank everyone for their participation in today's educational session. We hope you found it useful and insightful. And then there is a survey after today's session. If you want to go ahead and complete that, just as part of our follow-up feedback, let us know how we did, help us continue to improve these programs and these sessions moving forward. We will be sending out a link to the recorded session And then we also, just a reminder that we do have our next session December 9th. We're going to be going over a follow-up topic to the election, so the post-election updates in healthcare and regulatory updates, and that'll be on December 9th, at 1 p.m. Eastern as well. So thanks again for everyone who joined us today. Thank you, Jeffrey, for your participation as well, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our next sessions. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.